Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Julia. I was an admission officer at Haverford College, an outside reader for Emory University, and I currently work as a school-based counselor at a school in Massachusetts.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a wellness coach at the Keenan Flagler Business School at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. Good morning, friends. We're only 8 days away from our webinar with Matt Carpenter on all things paying for college. And it may be less than 8. That's 8 if you're listening on Monday when the episode drops. We'd love to have you attend. We've been getting over 100 people signing up for these webinars. And when you have a topic like this, the number is even higher. So by all means, we'd love to have you. Just go to yourcollegeboundkid.com and you can't miss the events tab and just sign up. Now, when you get into the webinar, you'll see the chat will be disabled, but the Q&A is not. So just put any questions that you want us to answer, not us meaning Matt you want Matt to answer. Just put them right into the Q&A, and then we'll get through as many of them as we possibly can. Very excited about that. All right, friends, my soliloquy section is going to be really, really short today. That's really hard for me because you guys know I'm a chatterbox. But the only reason why it's going to be so short is because I was such a chatterbox the rest of the episode. The podcast's already going to be over an hour. Julie and I, we have a segment. We start out talking. It's a continuation of the conversation that we had about University of Chicago and their new program. Some are calling early decision, or others are calling ED0, and who knows what other monikers will get attached to it over time. We start out continuing a few more thoughts on that we didn't think of at the time that we wanted to share. And then we just do one of these things that you guys have told us that you like. We just have a free-flowing conversation, the kind that we sort of always are having with each other. You guys just allowed to listen in on it, but just talk about some of the concerns that we have in counseling that I'm experiencing the counseling room, Julia's experiencing the counseling room, and we're hoping we can keep you guys from experiencing the pain that some people go through because they don't approach the process with the right mentality. And so we just sort of have a free-flowing conversation about that. And then after that, we transition to the interview Julie and I did with Jay Rosner, one of the country's foremost SAT, ACT experts, and he has been so for 40 years. And but over time, the longer that goes by, the less confident he is that there's value to the test to the extent that it's being used all across the country. And so we just continue to have an exchange with him, asking him the tough questions, getting his perspective, his thought, his experience. So hopefully you guys will enjoy this episode. But without any further ado, let's transition to my conversation with Julia. Okay, Julia, we talked before about summer programs, Wake Forest, UChicago a few weeks ago. I think we both thought of things afterward that we wanted to include. A lot of times that will happen to me before it goes to production, and then I just come in and just record something and insert it. I have the luxury of doing that as the producer. But this one was after it went to press. Here I'm talking about to press, to production. So why don't you share like a couple of things you thought, I kind of wish we also shared this, and then I have a thought or two on that as well.
Well, I first want to give credit to our lovely internal YCBK family, but also our listeners who are also really great about bringing up some really good and important work that Chicago is doing that does directly affect the program we were talking about, the early application, early decision, if you will, for students who do summer programs. Chicago has been part of the STARS network. It is housed at the University of Chicago, and the STARS network is, and I should have brought this up to say it exactly, but it
Small
targets
town and rural. Yeah, small town and rural. So it's a really cool acronym.
Yes.
Yeah, small town
I
and
do
rural.
like that.
Yeah.
So it's a small town rural network, and there's plenty of four-year colleges that are a part of this too, with the idea of providing access and resources to rural students. And now that doesn't necessarily mean these are low income. It doesn't mean they're BIPOC students. It does not mean that they are first generation. They just need to be in a rural or small town location. And so quite a few of the folks who are in the STARS network, if they do a program at University of Chicago over the summer, that whole thing is waived. There is no cost for that. Chicago has also waived the application fees for students who are part of that group as well. So even if they just apply to Chicago for college, that is not something that they have to pay for. And so I think it was important that we come back and tell the listeners that there are things that Chicago is doing in other schools that doesn't necessarily, it's not all, there might be some really good folks and really good access points that these new policies do create a better pathway, an affordable pathway for underrepresented students.
Yeah, and I wanted to comment on that too, because I know I made a big deal over the fact that $14,000 for the summer program, but they have online programs that are like really, really, really just a fraction of that. And I don't want to imply that there are not some much, much, much more affordable options. And so I felt strongly on that. I remember back when in 2018, when Chicago really was like a bomb because they were certainly the most selective national university to go test optional like a couple years before COVID. And it was a bomb because, test optional has been around now for 55 years, but for so long it was in the liberal arts and science schools, right? It was a big deal. And then you started to see it entering more into the universities. I remember Wake Forest in 2007 was a big deal. George Washington's been over a decade. Now Temple, Arizona State. But every one of those announcements was a pretty big announcement because it had really been confined to the smaller liberal arts and science school. But one of the things that Chicago did when they did roll it out, they had a whole bunch of other things they had thought through along the lines of how they could support under-resourced students. So it was a good rollout in that regard. Now, 90% of kids still have test scores there, so it's only a small percentage that is impacting. But that's true. Now, the other thing that I wanted to comment, this is going in a different direction. I think we're pretty positive about that I never shared, that concerns me. I do have the concern that we're driving the admission process earlier and earlier. And sure, I notice families reach out much, much earlier to work with us than they used to. And it's not always healthy. It's understandable, and it may be in somebody's best interest in many cases, though, depending on a lot of circumstances, right? There are a lot of factors that are involved in that, especially if somebody's hoping to visit schools and they're doing more of a national search. But if you're going to drive the process into the point where you're maybe making what some people are calling early. I've seen two terms for it, Julie. I've seen ED0 and early decision.
Yeah.
You kind of inevitably driving that process even earlier into the high school experience. Julie, another thing I wanted to say about our conversation about Chicago, my thoughts were stimulated by this by Jeffrey Zelengo, who, of course, we had recently on the podcast, and he has a newsletter. It's very good. It's called Next. And he came out with an article mostly focused on this. In some ways, it was very similar to what you and I were saying. He's like, I've been telling people all this time that these summer programs are not an asset for admissions, and it looks like that may be changing. But he said something, he went beyond that And this was based on a conversation that he had with another admission professional. He thinks the next step after these summer programs, which he thinks he does think there'll be more copycats, but he thinks the next step is going to be to marry the summer program early decision with direct admission. Now, if you guys don't know what we're talking about, there's a lot of terms. We've done quite a few podcasts on direct admission, which is really growing. And basically, it's schools accepting you without having to go through an application process. All right. Like they look, right now you don't see a lot of it at the uber selective schools, but it's really growing in popularity. In fact, Lisa did an interview with Jeremy Lowe from American on direct admission, the growth of direct admission and where it's going. So you might want to check that out in our archives. But it's a fascinating concept, right? Instead of going through all this rejection all the time and application fees, colleges get access to your profile and then they just admit the ones they want to admit. And you know what? That doesn't feel like a stretch to me because think about it. You had some application to apply, but even more so, if you've been living there for 3 weeks or even less than that, people get a chance to get a read on your personality and character. And they can turn around and admit you. I should say this. Karis went to Davidson College after doing their July experiences, was a 3-week summer residential program taught by their faculty. That has been different than these other programs because that does play a role in their admission process. So you might say, well, what's the difference? Well, one, it's not the whole ED thing only. And secondly, it was like $4,000 for 3 weeks. Of course, this was 10 years ago, so I got to check the price now. But it still wasn't like the price of some of these. I mean, it was a big investment, but it wasn't crazy investment.
Right.
Because even back then, like I remember talking to a senior level person in their admission office, and they said, you know what? If she can get a recommendation from one of her summer program professors, Gruber trusts our faculty over any AP or IB course.
Right. Or it's sort of like MIT mites, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Similar. Why don't you tell people what MIT mites is? They probably don't know what we're talking about.
I also might be outdated in my information. This was obvious. I learned about. I think the listeners know I used to direct multicultural recruitment, but especially MIT Mites was so great because they would have the college fair at the end, so I'd always be there. But really great for my College Horizon students. Mites really found a way to find rising juniors and seniors who might go to an under-resourced high school, and Mites sort of gave them it was an academic summer at MIT where it kind of didn't necessarily catch students up, but it gave them courses and experiences that would make them better prepared should they be admitted to MIT. And so there might be a student who on paper is fully admissible, but they come from a high school that maybe didn't prepare them super well for the introductory calculus class, right? Where if I had a student that maybe went to that high school and then they got into the MIT Mites program and they did that, MIT usually admitted them, not to say that it's one to the other, but now MIT had the confidence to know that the student would be successful in their program because they had gone through their program before.
Yeah, and MIT has a few programs like that, highly selective, specialized summer admit programs that are super competitive to get in, but getting in and doing well there you do have a higher admit rate. Coming on and applying. The one thing I'll tell everybody about Mites is unequivocal about the fact that they are targeting under-resourced students.
Right.
And I will get a lot of times, like very, very, very accomplished students and families. And even when they come to me, they'll be like, kind of surprised I didn't get into Mites. And they just missed that. Like they're not admitting you full pay family. That's not who the program is for.
Correct.
And so I just want to throw that out there. So, yeah, but it'll be interesting. But do you agree? Like, I can easily see the programs going to, well, we don't even need an application. We can just approach you and say, if you want an ED, you're in. Like, we've watched you. We've observed you. We've seen you for a while. we feel we have enough.
I could totally.
And oh my goodness, who knows where college
I know.
admissions is going to be? My head is spinning thinking about all the possibilities.
I know.
All right, one
Yeah.
step at a time. We won't get ahead of there yet, but keep an eye on that space. And I always think about a couple thoughts. I can't remember who to attribute this to, but I remember some time ago somebody said it was really profound. Like, there's all this talk in middle school about getting into the right independent school, and you get into the right independent school, and it's all about getting into the right college, and and then the right college is like getting the right professional program, the right grad school, and I was like, at what point do our kids ever get off the treadmill and just get a chance to be a kid?
Yeah.
I think about that a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then I think about it on school culture. I think about it on counselors. I think about it on, because if someone's thinking, oh, if I may have to go to this program to see if I'm going to ED, then they may also think, well, then maybe I need to go to other programs as well to compare to my other ED school to see if I really want to ED. And then, we know there's a whole mindset out there. And I know this is largely, contained with highly resourced families that have this luxury to be able to do this. But, I feel sometimes for those kids because I see the pressure that those kids are under. It's a different kind of problem than under-resourced families have, but it's still a problem. I was talking to one of my students like this, and and this was one of those ones that started at the end of ninth and doing everything, and it's so important to them that they go to a quote-unquote T20 school. It's like, and he'll be really nervous with me. Like he reached out to me. He's like, I'm looking at the TikTok videos of the kids getting in these places and I don't have a chance. And, and I had a set up a meeting with him and I was like, you have all the skill set to be extraordinarily successful no matter where you go. You really do. I really would just like to see you not feel so much pressure. And he said, it's just really hard with my parents. And he has great parents, but there's an expectation there, and he's feeling it. And then he's also into that peer group. So that combination of parents and peers, and then some kids are also just really perfectionistic themselves. And that's like the trifecta. And this particular student has all of it. Pressure from parents, pressure from the peer group, and then his own perfectionist orientation. So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that? I just overall don't see the driving of everything early and earlier as necessarily a healthy thing. Now, there's certainly people I see that start early and do it the right way because they do it with a light dose. I see parents that do it the right way, like parents that I just kind of want to understand how all this stuff works. So could we meet twice a year just to help me understand? Because if I understand how things work, that might impact what we do in summers or what we do on this. And I've seen that be really healthy. And I've seen other people do it in a way where it can decrease stress because it's more like a leisurely stroll over a long period of time than the mad dash at the end. And so there is a way to start early and have it reduce stress. But there's also a way for it to be like college obsession from the time you walk into high school. Any thoughts?
Completely agree with you. And this is probably most of what I do as a college counselor at an independent school is manage the stress and anxiety of the student in a selective college process. That is the majority of my job. It is not reading essays. It is not checking over the activities list. And like you said, the best of parents, this can happen to pretty much any family. If you're just in the waters, it's very hard not to participate or take in that noise or not to swim in those waters. And we forget too that these are adolescents. Their frontal lobe is not fully formed. They've not really existed in the real world. And it's so what they might emotionally know that they will land and they will be great and they can be successful anywhere. This might be often the first time in their life where their worth is being measured by what they perceive as an objective body. And so much of what they think their worth is wrapped up into the college name that they get into, right? And it's not that parents try to put that pressure on. It's just if you're part of
sort of certainly where I live, right? It is a almost 99% college going private 4-year institution group of people. And so, the bumper stickers on the cars, the Thanksgiving talk about where is your child applying? Oh, mine is, or we did a tour here, we did a tour there. And just even by talking about it, suddenly it becomes pressure for the student. It's a very delicate dance to try to be supportive of a student in selective college admissions and not allow for the student to have those really big or not. It's hard to combat those moments of anxiety. And as they say, we say a lot in the admissions world, comparison is the thief of joy. And that might be a mental exercise adults can do better than students. But I find a lot of adults in the process also do that. And you kind of compare by accident. Like, you think your kid hung the moon, right? And they did. But so does the other parent of their child, right? And so it's very hard to navigate selective college admissions, especially in a high octane world that we're talking about, and not let that anxiety get to you. And I think you're right. There's the school I'm at currently, I think, does a really lovely job and is very deliberate about starting the process early so that no one is taken off guard and feels ready and prepared and excited about the process being about self-discovery and not just about selective admissions. But it's light work like that, right? Just answering some myths, having just being a presence to families so they can just ask a one-off question. And the earlier you establish sort of like a trusting, good relationship with the college process, I do think that makes the outcome better. And then at the same time, at a school I worked with, we would have kindergarten parents come over to the college counseling office and ask what they should be doing right now. So I think everyone needs to be really mindful of how they engage with the process and to try to keep it focused on, it being a process of self-discovery, it being about fit and interest, knowing that your child will always be, or the child will always be successful as long as they go to an accredited institution that has what they're looking for.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify, I love it when schools start early. I never understood the people paying all this money to go to the schools and they're starting their process in like January of the junior year. Like that is so 20 years ago. Seriously. So I think starting early, but doing it in balance with perspective and moderation, I do think that's a good way to go. And I just want to be clear about that. You made a comment, most of your job is managing stress. I've thought about it this way. So much of my job is trying to preserve a healthy self-esteem for my students. And I know we're saying the same thing, just expressing it differently.
Yep.
So many times, and I know you're the same way, Julia, because, we talk all the time, but the average family just has no idea how big that world is out there.
Yes.
And how few spots are actually available to them. So what it means is the majority of the time when we're working with a family that's looking at selective admissions, the majority of the time they come to us with top-heavy list or top-heavy expectations.
Right.
It's pretty rare that the opposite occurs. It happens, but it's more rare where someone's like, oh, can never even get in any of those schools. And we're like, no, you need to have some of them on your list. Like that doesn't happen that often. And so what that means many times is the news that we're sharing when it comes to giving people a sense of their chances at different places is not always what people want to hear, or it's different than what they're expecting. And I think for a lot of people, that would be really, really, really difficult.
Yes.
It would be really, really, really difficult. I mean, difficult to the point where I can't do this difficult. I was having lunch with one of my former clients a little while ago, and the parent, and because she had referred me to a sibling, and we were just talking, and I was like, I love my job, but it's hard. And she said, of course it's hard. You have to tell people something they don't want to hear. Of course.
I know.
But the reason I'm sharing this, the reason why I still love that is because at the end of the day, I feel like I'm doing things to help the self-esteem of the kid. Because so much of this is about proper expectations. And it doesn't mean not to shoot for a few of those aspirational schools. But if you shoot for them with the mindset that it's probably not going to happen, but I'm going to do my best and do it anyway, it still stings, but it doesn't sting anywhere near as much if you're surprised you weren't getting in. And it's very easy for people to go through the emotional adjustment of, oh my goodness, I didn't think I was going to get in. And I'm in. Like, I can think of a couple people I worked with this year that got in, like the elites of the elites, and they kind of didn't think they were getting in. And it was not hard for them to make that emotional adjustment back to, if anything, it just was like jubilation on steroids.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's it. And, just be careful, parents. Like, one of the things that I see a lot, and it concerns me, is where people choose to do their tours.
I know. That's honestly where it starts most of the time.
And it immediately creates an expectation in the eyes of the student. And I really think sometimes parents don't realize it's very important to kids that they feel like they're pleasing their parents or that they're living up to their expectations. Comment on that a little bit more, Julia, because that's where it starts. Don't you see over and over and over, oh, I'm going, I see it coast to coast, and they just want to go to what I call the one percenters, the reach for alls.
Yes, that's always the college tours always start. I've had families where we do start in the January of the junior year, and I have families that started this in the 9th grade year, and they have the same college tour list, which I think is hilarious because you don't even know what student, high school student. It's because you start with, I know the idea is you start with where you know, right? But the problem is the one percenters as well already hold a spot likely in somebody's brain. Don't forget that they might not know much about Stanford, but it's in that Disney show that your kid is watching. It's in, people know it. And so when you start there, even if the student doesn't get the perception from the parent that that's where the parent wants them to go, what happens is I find too that the subsequent colleges that a student sees, they're not seeing in a real light because they're perpetually comparing the rest of the colleges they look at, and they tend to get their list from a college counselor, right? And then they're like, oh gosh, I really got to go look at these target and likelies, and I didn't. But because you started in the unlikelies, all of those reaches, targets, and likelies become really unattractive to your student, and they're not really looking at them with the right set of eyes because they've kind of been set up for like what they perceive as the best of the best. And so anything after that, like I have my what I always tell parents, I said, please don't go to Brown. I've never had a student visit Brown and be like, you know what, I didn't like it there. Like you could be completely different student to the next student and you'll still love it. And then I have a hard time getting the student off of that, and they apply early, they don't get in, and then the whole process is broken. Just because I know it was in your best interest, and sometimes these one percenters are also in areas where there's other selective colleges, so it makes sense to go visit this cluster. But I really am a big proponent of, especially, I mean, this is a luxury of where I live. I live outside of Boston, right? But there are plenty of likely regional colleges and or colleges in a city near you that are non-selective. And I say start there. It doesn't matter if it has nothing to do with your kid's interests. They just need to see what college is and what's possible with that. And I actually think they'll be a lot more open and have a more realistic list if you don't set it up with, when I say college, I mean Ivy Leagues, I mean Stanford, I mean Northwestern, I mean Duke. I've never had a family ever be like, oh, you know what? First we're going to Merrimack College, then I'm going to go see Fairfield. It's always starting with the Ivy Leagues in New England, for example.
Yeah, I really see it with Duke and Chapel Hill, that combo, like coming in, and that's the combo they go for. I see it just all the time. And, the other thing too is like when people don't do that, when they visit targets and likeliest probables, the parent has to kind of be in the mindset of this could be a good option, because sometimes it's like, well, I know I can't only visit those. And normally that only happens with us coaching that. If we don't do the coaching, that won't happen.
Nope.
So then you do, but then you do it sort of reluctantly. Like, I don't think I'm going to like this school, but we'll do it. And like everybody picks the body language up, and it's very different having likelies, targets, probables on your list that you're excited about versus, well, I kind of know I need to check this box and just have them.
100%.
But I'm not going there, you know?
Yep.
I'm not,
Oh
that's
my
the
gosh.
mindset. I'll do it because, one, I agree, it's too risky. But people almost say that in theory to them.
Yes.
And their mindset is, I'm not going, but I'll do it. And I do agree I should do it just to, like, I'll take out a little bit of insurance. My house is probably not going to burn down, but I'll take out insurance because I know I just should. And you're telling me, but oh my goodness, I'm not going.
That, and I also, friends, I often see, and Mark, you probably do too. In that case, sometimes there's maybe one or two, if I'm lucky, likely schools on there. And sometimes the student applies their early action, right? Because they're like, oh, you know what? I'll appease my college counselor. I'll cash in that insurance early. And then maybe we missed an early decision, or we missed in another more selective first choice school that's early action. And then the student goes into the regular round saying, oh, but I got into these two likelies. So you know what? I'm just going to shoot for the stars. I have never in that situation had a student come out on the other side and not go into a fetal position, because they think at the time, I'm into college at two places, but because they didn't do the investment of actually loving their likelies, they now get sort of what tends to be mostly all rejections from everything in their regular decision. And now they don't also feel like they have a choice in where they're going to college. And so it really sets the whole process off. And I love using this saying that my former colleague, Terry James Solomon, said, which is just like what you said, Mark, about building up self-esteem, is that I want your child to leave this process whole. It's not, I want your child to land somewhere. I want your child to have multiple options. They need to leave the process whole. And even if they get into two colleges that are their likelies, if they didn't love their likelies, they didn't do the research, that child is not leaving the process whole.
Yeah, and one of the absolute best ways to do that is to expand your mindset of what you think of as a good school. You know, and that's as much to parents as it is to students, because most of the times when I see students embracing a much larger list as being good, it's because the parents did it.
Yep.
The parents got them there. And so these are just some things, you know, we're sharing. There are things we see in the counseling room where, you know, I know it seems like we come back to this theme a lot, but we want kids to be whole. We want kids to feel great about themselves. And I'm going to preach this until I'm black and blue in the face, Julia. And just because a school's harder to get into, it doesn't make it a better school for you.
Right.
And that tends to be how people keep score. Harder to get in equals better.
Better.
You know, but better for who?
Right.
That's the problem with the rankings. Rankings for who? Better for who? No problem with selectivity being a part of your process, even a huge part of your process, not the only part. And I've shared this before, but I'll share it again. Like, I worked with a transfer student who absolutely despised the school he was at. And really early on, and I said, can I ask you why you picked it? How could I turn it down? It had an 8% admit rate. How could I turn that down? You know, that didn't match anything else at all. You know, I'm having a situation like this right now where the dad is all about rankings. And the student and the mom are about fit and match. And so, like, I'm in there navigating, you know, between both of them. And so, you know, we had a parent meeting this week, and first the parents they were saying that our student is struggling because she can't decide whether she wants to play her sport in college or not. And I was like, well, you want to know how I feel she's struggling? She's really struggling between wanting to please you and keep you happy, but what you want for her is not what she wants for herself. And that's creating angst. I'm going to have those tough conversations because I'm trying to protect the kid's self-esteem. But I just think it's things that people need to think through. People mean well. They love their kids. But they don't realize the pressure that little things like where you visit, or what you convey as a good school, or, oh, everybody goes there, everybody gets in there,
Right.
and how it impacts things. So I know this is the soapbox. I know we come back to it again, but it's only because, it's just something we counter over and over and over again.
Right.
And sometimes if parents could hear the things that students share to us in private and confidence, about the pressure they're under, I think it would help. So hopefully this was helpful for you guys. Thanks, Julia.
Thank you.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, in part 2 of 4 of the interview Julie and I did with Jay Rosner, Jay explains what he believes the motivations are for elite colleges returning to standardized testing. Jay answers the question, why should a highly selective school not use testing? After all, they need some factors to differentiate where most students have all A's and embellished recs and professionally polished writing. Jay rebuts the diamond in the rough theory that he says has been around for decades, that argues that test scores help you identify strong kids that are not highly resourced. Listen and enjoy.
One of the arguments that I used to hear from admissions officers who favored the SAT would be, and you two have heard this 1,000 times, well, more information is better. Right? We have the SAT score. Yes, it's problematic, but we know how to deal with it, and we, contextualize it, and just having it more information is better. Well, why isn't more information better on this research of the predictive power of the SAT, and that more information is factoring in and removing the fact of socioeconomic status? So I want to hear the admissions officers argue that more information is better in using SAT, but more information is not better in researching the SAT. I mean, there's so many rich contradictions in this domain. One of the reasons I've been able to focus on testing it's almost 40 years, not quite, Mark, but I'm very close, is I'm continually stunned by how misinformation plays in this domain and how people really don't see the SAT for what it is and where it came from and what it does, and how my friend Claude Steele, the eminent Stanford researcher, stereotype threat is a field of inquiry that he basically established. Claude says the SAT launders socioeconomic status. I say the SAT sanitizes socioeconomic status. You don't have to accept students with high SAT scores. You can just take the high income students and they'll have the high scores. You don't have to bother with the SAT. You can be honest and say, we're not going by high SAT scores. We're going by high income. They correlate pretty closely. We'll get approximately the same results, and they will.
What's your theory for the reasons why, Stanford, Harvard, Yale, Brown, Dartmouth, Georgetown, a few others, Caltech recently?
Yes.
What is your theory for the reason they have reinstated SATs and ACTs?
Well, I think the place to start there is the New York Times and the Washington Post and the National Review, the conservative magazine started by William F. Buckley. All three of those publications have editorialized in favor of universities going back to requiring the SAT. Now, strange bedfellows, liberals and conservatives, why are they in agreement? It may have something to do with elitism. Just may. There are a lot of conservatives who criticize Harvard and Yale and the Ivies. They send their kids there, but they criticize those liberal institutions. I think, and the New York Times and the Washington Post have given lots of press to was first Dartmouth and then Brown and then Yale and Harvard reverting to requiring test scores. They get so much press. I've had a bunch of friends ask me, wow, there's this real movement back to requiring test scores, right? And I said, yeah, it's like 20 schools out of 850. It's a trickle. It's nothing. But it is it's not nothing because it's name brand schools. But by the numbers, it's a fraction, it's a single digit percentage of colleges that are going back. I think they're going back to elitism, going back because of a general favorability of elitism. And I'll mention hierarchy again. How do we know where these schools are on the hierarchy unless they have the highest test scores? Because we don't want to be crude and say, well, which schools have the wealthiest student bodies? Although we could, and we have. And the statistics on that. All the schools that have more students from the top 1% than the bottom 60%. So I think a reversion of test scores is driven, and I don't say these colleges do it consciously. I think I would attribute, if I can attribute good motivations, the motivations are more information is better. Let's have the test score. More information is better. I think perhaps, if not conscious, there's a subconscious motivation to let's shore up our elite status, make sure we have as much of the protections of that in place as we can.
Do you think then, Jay, would it be safe for me to say then that for the colleges that haven't maybe ponied up or shown their research, that's just they also either felt pressure because their peer institutions went back to requiring it, and they all like to maintain their elite status together? I'm thinking like, even when I used to do college fairs, they're alphabetical, the colleges, right? And almost every fair I was at, the Ivy Leagues would all move their spots in the college fair to be next to each other. Maybe not the same thing, but would you say that that's why maybe some of the schools quickly reversed their policies after Dartmouth and Brown and Yale made their announcements?
Peer pressure plays a role. Another role is played by having one key person in the hierarchy, in the university hierarchy, be in favor of test scores. If you have a president of your university who's, could go either way, but a provost who's really in favor of test scores, and a director of admissions who could go either way, or maybe is very much in favor of remaining test optional, that provost is going to win the battle. And it's often one key person. It's sometimes peer pressure. My sense in talking to admissions officers is that most of the assistant admissions officers, and I could be wrong about this, most of the assistant admissions officers at Ivy type schools would prefer to remain test optional and would probably prefer to go test free, but they're not the decision makers. And so we have a generational thing also here, because the older folks, often white guys, but not always, have dealt with tests, for the 40 years of their career. They're comfortable with them. They feel that they're added value, even though Saul Geiser's research shows that they're just not in any impressive way. And so they want to continue to do what they've always done. So those are several of the factors that I feel lead to the return. Several additional factors that lead to the reversion to requiring test scores.
I don't know if this makes sense to stay on this wavelength, which is maybe the main wavelength, but. Jay, I think I know your answer, but what do you say to, certainly I worked at a school like this that had, since COVID, rampant grade inflation. Independent schools, especially where you do see a high concentration of wealthy students, those schools have gotten rid of
AP courses. They don't have grade distribution charts. They don't have ranks in their school. And a common argument I've heard for the return of standardized testing is that in a sea of all A's, why not use that metric to then differentiate between all of those high achievers on the GPA side?
So, Julia, people view this as a new argument. I've heard grade inflation arguments for 40 years. There's a new intensity. I don't deny that there's a new intensity to that argument, but it's a very old argument. So we've had grade inflation forever, number one. Number two, grade inflation is worst at schools that serve the wealthiest students, both private and public. And that makes common sense because you have parental pressure on the teachers and community pressure. And we want all our kids to go to Harvard or Stanford. And that kind of pressure just does not exist at that level at other kinds of schools. So I place faith in admissions officers to look at the rich information in a file and to see that, well, all the kids at this school get all A's. So that's not a piece of information that I can use to differentiate this student. So it's actually what grade inflation leads to is the need for admissions officers to very, very carefully consider other information and more detailed information than just GPA. In other words, course sequence, the kinds of things that the University of California, by the way, people ask me, well, without test scores, what are they looking at? Well, they had 14 factors when they included test scores. They got rid of test scores. They now have 13 factors. And I looked at the 13 factors, and they don't even list essays, and they require essays. So they're forgetting one of their own factors. But the UC 13 factors includes things that you would, admissions officers have always looked at, and that is specific courses and the progression of grades from freshman to senior year, and the number of courses taken in any one given subject or domain. So doing sort of the disaggregated data of grade point average yields a whole bunch of information. So I think the reflexive over the last 40 years pitch to grade inflation as a reason we need test scores is just overblown, and there are lots of other factors that could be and grade inflation isn't fooling any admissions officer, by the way, because people think, oh, that's going to fool the admissions officer. It's just not. So I think that's an argument, and there's also test score inflation. SAT scores have not only gone up kind of surprisingly in the last 7 or 8 years, they've also gotten very unstable. And so by talking about grade inflation, folks then don't have to talk about A, test score inflation, and B, test score instability, which are nobody's talking about. And those are real issues also. So that's how I would respond to the grade inflation argument. It's a real thing. It's just no reason to require a test score.
So Jay, here's another argument, and I'm going to kind of approach it partly from what the perspective one of our listeners shared, and then partly sort of from some of the arguments you heard from Stu at MIT. So this listener was saying, hey, listen, my kid's from a rural environment, and all of that's fairly underserved, and all of the other things that people get credit for, they really don't help me. So I'm not going to be able to be full pay. I'm not going to have legacy. I'm not going to have all these extracurriculars. There's been a lot of research that's come out to show that writing may be one of the more biased aspects of the file because you can hire the writing coaches and do all that. And then the recommenders at the independent schools, the recommenders know the kids well and come from college admissions and can write rich, detailed descriptions of kids. I'm not going to have that in my big underserved public school. So test scores actually present an opportunity for me, for my kid to sort of show their chops, which is kind of that argument that if you heard Stu at MIT, he kind of said that, right? Like this, you can identify some kids that truly are exceptional if they have high test scores and have overcome a lot of obstacles or are not necessarily privileged. That's one way of a kid standing out. So I don't know if I'm articulating this very well, but hopefully I framed it enough so that you could give a response.
Yes, you have. And this is an argument that is new. I just didn't really hear that argument, and I don't know if the two of you did, prior to 5 or 6 years ago. That test, well, actually, let me adjust that. There's a diamond in the rough argument that's always been made. And in fact, when President Conant of Harvard decided to require the SAT, he was thinking his diamond in the rough was the farm kid from Kansas, a white male, but that would diversify his campus, and from the rich white male and rich New England white males, and so the diamond in the rough argument was started to be made back in the inception of the SAT, but I haven't heard it made with regard to underrepresented minority students very much, or low-income students, or rural students. And by the way, when the SAT profoundly discriminates against rural students, the disparities on average are huge. That's huge. That's a category I could have included earlier. The more common way to see the argument, I think, is you've presented a rich, detailed way, and I'll get to that in a moment. More common way to see the argument is, well, a high test score would draw our attention to this student who has a mediocre high school grade point average, wasn't challenged, had to work. I mean, all kinds of good, really bona fide reasons to explain a mediocre high school GPA, but the student goes in for 3 hours, although it's 2 hours for the SAT, and gets a high score. That's something that will advantage that student. That's true. It's just that there aren't a lot of those students. There are very few. There aren't a lot of rural students who get that high test score. Very, very few. So to impose a policy of universal testing requirement on everybody to find this 0.5% of students or less is just not a good reason for a policy. Figure out some other way to find that student. And by the way, for the University of California, and this would be a curious experiment to do. The University of California, which doesn't require test scores, I'd like to see actually some rural kid from California who is in that situation and takes a test and petitions the University of California to consider the test because of exactly the reasons that you stated. And my guess is they'd make an exception and let that kid in. And the 5 or 10 or 15 rural kids in California who this year could do that, maybe should do it. I don't know if my friends at the University of California will get irritated with me for suggesting this, but you're dealing with such an outlier, exceptional situation that it's one thing to talk about it. It's another thing to justify an entire system of rank ordering students just so you can find a few of those kids. That's bad policymaking. And I'll give you a policy analogy. It's really bad policymaking to design a Social Security deduction system where people who earn above 140,000 or what have you don't pay any more into Social Security than, in other words, the payments are capped. So you have a Social Security deduction system that's actually designed to favor the relatively small percentage of folks who earn, more than whatever it is, $140,000 a year. That's really bad policy making. And those of us who are progressive agree with that. So a policy that's designed to address outliers just usually makes no sense. And that's would be my response here.
So by that logic, Jay, and I think the listeners know my feeling on this, what's your response to Dartmouth saying in their research that they missed out on some applicants they could have admitted should they had they provided their SAT scores?
That's actually a tricky one. And I have to think, you're refreshing my recollection on that one. I have to think about that a little bit. My first question would be, was there no other sign that this student, you're probably looking at the 13 factors that the University of California is looking at, maybe more. Was there nothing in any of that you needed that number? So I would like to see the rich information that was available and why nothing in that rich information indicated what a test score indicated. And I'm willing to believe that the test score really offered something unique and special and that was not duplicated anywhere else. But again, what numbers are we talking about? What percentages are we talking about? Are we focusing so much on the exceptions to the rule that we're losing track of what the rule is doing, what the damage the rule is doing? And the rule of requiring tests does significant damage. Its disincentive effects to students of color, to underrepresented minority students and low-income students, the disincentives of a test score requirement in terms of taking the test and submitting the test are enormous, and they dwarf any benefit from on these exceptions. And so again, it's you're building a case on an exception. And that's problematic. And in that case, you're building a case on an exception and you're not giving us access to the other information that was available to see if that even really was an exception.
Friends, this concludes part 2 of Julie and I in our interview with Jay Rosner. We hope you'll join us next week for part 3. Friends, on Thursday's episode, we'll start out with a question from a listener. This time we are going to answer the question from Asaf from Rochester. I promised it last week, and then I realized, snap, dude, I haven't recorded that yet. But we did record it on Saturday, so you'll get that question, a series of questions related to honors colleges. And then our roundtable's back. It's the last segment. Our roundtable's having a mom send in several questions, and so we just answer those questions. And then we transitioned to the interview that I did with Stephen Bird and Don Hostler, continuing the conversation about enrollment management and talking particularly about a couple really big companies that are the invisible hand that shapes so many decisions that are made in the field of admissions that often very few people know about. So, if you want to know how the sausage is made, it's a good interview, and it'll be part 3 of 4. And then Lisa and I pick up our college spotlight on the University of South Carolina, recounting recent visits we've had there and just a free-flowing exchange of ideas. That's a 3-parter, and this will be part 2 of 3. So we hope you'll join us on Thursday for that episode. And friends, I close you with this. There really is no such thing as the best college. I bristle, I recoil anytime I ever hear someone say best college, because there's no such thing as best college. There's only best college match. That's because college is a match to be made and not a prize to be won. See you on Thursday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joyce Ducker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stelianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.